Old Testament history.
Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon.
During the late 7th century BC, Judah was a vassal kingdom of Babylon. As a vassal kingdom, they were expected to pay allegiance and tribute to Babylon and their king Nebuchadnezzar. But in 601 BC, King Jehoiakim of Judah made the decision to revolt against Babylon, which ultimately led to a 30-month siege of Jerusalem in 597 BC. Jehoiakim died before the siege ended. The Book of Chronicles states that he was bound in fetters and carried off to Babylon. The prophet Jeremiah prophesied that King Jehoiakim would die without proper burial. His son Jeconiah succeeded him as king and reigned only 3 months and 10 days before King Nebuchadnezzar seized Jerusalem and sent King Jeconiah and other high-class citizens into captivity. Nebuchadnezzar eventually installed Zedekiah, Jeconiah's uncle, as king, guided by the fear that Jeconiah would revolt due to his father's death. Not long after, King Zedekiah, having entered into an alliance with the Pharaoh of Egypt, launched a revolt against Babylon. The Babylonian Empire was sent to retake Jerusalem. In either August 587 BC or July 586 BC, the Babylonians took Jerusalem, destroyed Solomon's temple, and then burned the city down. Thus, the kingdom of Judah was abolished and annexed as a Babylonian province with its center in Mizpah. The Judean elite, including the Davidic dynasty, were exiled to Babylon, as was the standard practice of invading rulers at the time. Nebuchadnezzar ordered the most intelligent and knowledgeable youths of noble blood to be brought to the land of Shinar. Among these noble Judahites were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, whose names were changed to Belshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
Daniel's interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream.
In Daniel chapter 2, King Nebuchadnezzar had a troubling dream that he didn't reveal to his magicians, astrologers, or sorcerers so that they couldn't pretend to know the interpretation. This was apparently a test of their abilities, and these wise men insisted that there was no way to interpret a dream if they didn't know the dream in the first place. The king was angered by this, so he commanded all the wise men of Babylon to be destroyed. When it came time to kill Daniel and his 3 friends, Daniel asked to be given some time, and then he'll provide the dream and its interpretation to the king. According to Daniel chapter 2, verse 19, the secret was revealed in a night vision, and Daniel blessed the God of heaven for it. Then Daniel told Arioch, the man who was ordered to kill all the wise men in Babylon, to bring him to the king first so that he could give Nebuchadnezzar the interpretation. In the presence of these very same magicians, astrologers, and sorcerers who said it was impossible, Daniel, after declaring it was the God of heaven who had revealed the secret of the dream and its interpretation, went on to tell Nebuchadnezzar exactly what he had dreamed. Now remember, Nebuchadnezzar didn't tell anyone what he had dreamed. The only way for Daniel to have known is if it was revealed, which it was by God in a night vision. The dream and its interpretation is told to us in the book of Daniel. It tells us of a great image or statue with a head of gold, chest and arms of silver, belly and thighs of brass, legs of iron, and feet of part iron and part clay. Daniel explained to Nebuchadnezzar that the gold head is representative of the Babylonian Empire. And now, after the interpretation, we know that the 4 kingdoms are the Babylonian, Medo-Persian, Greek, and Roman empires.
Alexander the Great.
Alexander the Great was born in Pella, the ancient capital of Macedonia, in July 356 BC to his mother, Olympia of Epirus, and his father, Philip II, king of Macedon. In his youth, Alexander was taught by the Greek philosopher Aristotle. When Philip II was assassinated in 336 BC, Alexander took over the kingdom at just 20 years old, becoming one of the iconic and famous figures of the ancient world. Like the Babylonian kings, Alexander was also mentioned in the Bible through prophecy by the prophet Daniel.
Daniel's visions.
In Daniel chapter 8, we are told of Daniel's vision of the demise of the Medo-Persian Empire, which had in 539 BC overtaken the Babylonian Empire. Both empires are named in the book of Daniel, chapters 8 and 10. The first half of chapter 8 is very symbolic, with a vision of a ram with 2 horns, one longer than the other, representing the empire of the Medes and the Persians. A goat is then mentioned, and its horn represents Alexander the Great. Daniel goes on to prophesy the end of Alexander's empire, which would take place nearly 2 centuries later.
Alexander meeting the Jewish high priest.
Antiquities of the Jews tells us of when Alexander the Great had written an epistle to the Jewish high priest, who, according to the Mishnah of the Talmud, is identified as the last of the men of the Great Assembly. or Shimon HaTzadik, translated to Simon the Just or Righteous, rather than Jaddua or Jadus as commonly known. Alexander demanded soldiers, provisions, and for all tribute formerly sent to Darius to now be sent to him instead. But the high priest answered back that he wouldn't send soldiers to aid Alexander in a war against Darius to whom he'd sworn an oath, not while Darius was still alive. Angry at this answer, Alexander decided that although he wouldn't leave Tyre just yet, he would eventually make an example of the high priest to teach all men to whom they must keep their oaths. After taking Tyre and settling affairs there, Alexander came to Gaza, besieged the city, and then made his way to Jerusalem. Knowing that the Macedonian king was on his way to Jerusalem, the high priest, in agony and terror and not knowing how to greet the Macedonians, ordained that the people should call out to God and join him in an offering. Then in a dream, God told the high priest to take courage, to adorn the city and open the gates, and that everyone should appear in white garments, but he and the priests should meet the king in the habits proper to their order, without the dread of any ill consequences, which the providence of God will prevent. The high priest told everyone what he had dreamed, and they did as instructed. Once Alexander was at the gates, the high priest went out in procession with the priests and a multitude of people. The procession was venerable and different from the greetings of other nations. When he saw the priests in their garments, Alexander went to greet them by himself and first saluted the high priest. The Jews raised their voices to salute the king and stood around him. The king's company, including the kings of Syria, thought Alexander had gone mad. Even Parmenion, one of Alexander's generals, a man who had previously served his father Philip II, asked the king how it came to pass that when all others adored him, he should adore the high priest of the Jews, to which Alexander replied, "I did not adore him, but that God who has honored him with his high priesthood. For I saw this very person in a dream, in this very habit, when I was at Dios in Macedonia." This dream that Alexander had occurred 3 years prior. In it, he sees this very same high priest wearing the very same garments, encouraging him to wait no more, to take Asia, and that Persia will fall under his dominion. Because of this dream, Alexander knew he'd conquer Darius and destroy the power of the Persians. After saying this to Parmenion, Alexander the Great went into the city and then into the high temple, where he offered a sacrifice to God according to the high priest's direction. And when he was shown the book of Daniel, written approximately 250 years prior, of how a Greek would destroy the Persian Empire, Alexander knew it was about him. The next day, Alexander asked the people what they wanted. The high priest asked to continue their customs and their laws of their forefathers and to not pay tribute in the 7th year. The king granted it. They also asked if he would permit the Jews in Babylon and Media the same thing as well. The king willingly promised to do so in exchange for soldiers who were also allowed to continue their practices while serving in his army. He was, according to the account, willing to take many with him, and many were ready to accompany him in his wars.
Flavius Josephus.
Flavius Josephus was a 1st century Roman Jewish military leader and historian whose notable work, The Jewish War, has been described by Steve Mason, Bible scholar and professor of classics, history, and religious studies, as perhaps the most influential non-biblical text of Western history. Then there's the 20-volume
Historiographical
work Antiquities of the Jews, written in Greek by Flavius Josephus in 93 or 94 CE. It begins with the first 10 volumes following the events of the Hebrew Bible, beginning with the creation of Adam and Eve, and the second 10 volumes continues the history beyond the biblical text up to the Jewish War, or the First Jewish-Roman War, 66 through 73 CE, that were widely circulated during Josephus' time. The Jews were harshly accused of great hostility towards non-Jews and were generally thought to be disloyal and disrespectful to authority. With this kind of propagated talk against the Jews going around the Roman Empire, Josephus wanted to set the record straight by giving a Hellenistic version of Jewish history. This kind of work is known as an apologia, as it pleads the case of a group of people or a set of beliefs to a larger audience.
Myth versus history.
Most scholars agree that Flavius Josephus' account in Antiquities of the Jews is not true. As is common with many historians at the time, it could very well be an exaggerated story in favor of Jewish storytelling, given that many historians conclude that Alexander the Great would not have taken a detour into Jerusalem. However, according to Dutch historian Jona Lendering on Livius.org, these arguments should be looked at for closer inspection. Included in the account is Sanballat the Samaritan, his son-in-law Manasseh, who was brother to the high priest Jadis, in the building of a temple upon Mount Gerizim. Sanballat had renounced Darius and approached Alexander the Great about his plan to build a temple in which Manasseh would serve as high priest. To this, Alexander agreed, and a temple was built, which was supposed to be like the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. It begs the question of why the Jews would preserve this piece of history that allows the Samaritans to have built their own temple. It stands as a logical form of punishment that the rivals, the Samaritans, would be allowed this temple after the Jews refused to send soldiers and provisions to Alexander. And then there is the matter of Alexander the Great granting the Jews the freedom to practice their customs. This isn't a special treatment as one might suppose, since they'd already received these privileges by the Persian kings. Lastly, Alexander's dream of seeing the Jewish high priest and then offering a sacrifice to the God of Israel seems much too unbelievable to have been invented for the purpose of Jewish storytelling. Alexander himself claimed to have been the son of the Greek god Zeus. In Egypt, he was worshipped as Amun-Ra, in Persia as Marduk, in India as Nagas, the same serpent gods worshipped by his mother Olympia. There are no findings of Alexander the Great and a link to the Jewish god. Another aspect is the demand for provisions and tribute formerly sent to the Persian Empire. This matches the demand made by Alexander that Darius would address him as the master of Persian possessions.
And that's just some, but many ways the Bible lines up with history.